Welcome to another edition of Faithful Questions. Hope everyone's happy to be here on this cold but dry night, even though it was raining this morning. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together this evening and for the many ways that you bless us. Thank you for the technology that allows this to be live streamed and for the facilities that allow us to host it in person. We ask that you make this evening an opportunity to both be thankful for the many medical advances that allow us to improve our lives and extend them, but also have some realism as to when it is our time. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. Okay, so topic for the evening. Is it okay to take my mom off of life support? Now, maybe that is a topic that you're thinking you're the mom. Maybe this is the topic you're thinking you're the child. The talk hopefully will be valuable to all. Let's go into an overview here. First, we're going to talk, and I think this is really important, we're going to talk about different forms, I lost my audio there for a second, different categories of medical intervention. Because I think if you properly separate out what separates different types of medical interventions, it really helps simplify the matter. So we're going to start with that and then go into there. Then we're going to spend, it's actually just a few slides on what the teaching is. Then we'll have intermission, and after that, we'll go over some specific scenarios. I'm having some audio trouble here. Any sense of where this is happening there, Andrew? Okay. And then finally, we'll talk about the issues surrounding when you can't make these decisions for yourself, which is actually the premise of the talk. But really, the overall point here is, or the premise of the question, the overall point here is... Sorry for these issues. Test, test, test. Okay, we're going to hope that's better. But it is important to talk about when and what to do if you are responsible for making decisions for someone else. First, introduction stuff, references. I really want to bring out this document that the USCCB has put out. A lot of times we underestimate how much good work the national body of Catholics is doing. And this document in particular is very helpful. So I've given a link here. It's called the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Health Services. It covers all kinds of stuff. The 5th section is about medical decisions, written in 2009, and it's very good. So this is where, if you're looking for, okay, where is Deacon Ken getting his authoritative information? This is it. Okay, next couple things. Questions. We have the ability to ask questions here in person, and we have the ability to ask questions online. Because there are people online, it's very important that you have a question, that you wait for the microphone, because they really can't hear you at home unless you're on a microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll come to you, hand you the microphone. It's very important that you push that microphone right up to your lips. It doesn't work 6-8 inches away. You need it, a finger's width away from your mouth. And then, of course, hand the mic back when you're done. For those of you who are online, the best way to make a comment is to get logged in on this YouTube video with one of your Google accounts. It can be a Gmail account, a Google account, a YouTube account. It really doesn't matter what kind. Any Google-related account can log in to a YouTube live stream. And once you've done that, that opens up the chat session. And you can talk about whatever you want with the people in the chat room. But if you want to ask a question, start your comment with all capitals, Deacon Question dash, and then whatever your question is. We will probably hold some of those for intermission. Please know there's a bit of a delay, so when you ask a question, it's going to be like a minute before I see it, and therefore I've likely moved on. So we'll tend to group them up around the intermission times. If you just can't get logged in on YouTube, we do have an open chat session at deaconken.org/blog/chat. Same thing, you're free to have any discussion you want, but if you want me to answer it, all capitals, Deacon Question. Okay, let's get into it. And again, the first topic here is about the types of medical care. The first category we want to discuss is what is called ordinary medical care. And here's the definition that the USCCB uses. It's a very common definition in the Catholic medical ethics world. It is in the judgment of the patient that ordinary care offers a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. So it's something that we think is going to work, and we think that it's something not overly burdensome, and that can be burdensome to your body. It could also be burdensome from a cost perspective or something like that. So, an example of medical care, or ordinary medical care. Food and water, including medically assisted food and water like feeding tubes, ordinary pain medication, waste management of the human body, things like catheters, bedpans, being cleaned and all of these types of things, antibiotics, very regular stuff that you think of is ordinary care. The interesting thing for me about ordinary care is it's not a static thing. It varies both by the wealth of the region, what would be considered medical care here in the United States or Western Europe. Some of that at least would not be considered ordinary care in poor regions of the world. So there was a discussion, one of the things I saw that said you could argue that dialysis is ordinary care in the United States at this point. Definitely, obviously, in some third world country that wouldn't be true. And it can also change over time. 50 years ago, even in the United States, dialysis would not be considered a ordinary care. But now as it's become more effective, that we've found more effective ways to do it and cheaper, it's become easier to do. And it's easier to argue that it is now ordinary care. And so that actually, those two things combined make it so there is no easy way to set this line and say, this is ordinary, this is extraordinary. It's actually a much vaguer thing that we have to use our judgment and also rely on the experts who might be able to help us. Okay, extraordinary medical care. Now, these are treatments that either don't offer reasonable hope of benefit or they entail an excessive burden or excessive expense on the family or the community. So these are things that would go beyond the easy that is now a harder thing to do. The one catch here I would say that we need to be careful in this definition is it kind of makes it sound like, why would you do any of this? And I think this definition is worded a little poorly. I use the definition that is in the document, so I don't want to be unfaithful to that in the sense of writing down what I say my reference is. But I think what's missing here is a perspective that says that you could do these things. It's just they're beyond ordinary. It's okay to do things like a heart transplant or advanced cancer treatments with a success that's low, massive resuscitation efforts, life support. These things can be done, but there is some recognition that the likelihood of success, the likelihood of benefit is going down a little bit or significantly, and therefore it is no longer ordinary. But that doesn't mean it's not allowable. It's just now in this separate category of extraordinary, and we'll see why that's important a little bit later. All right, this is a really important one that a lot of people don't know a lot about yet because the category is, relatively speaking, new. It's the idea of palliative medical care. Palliative medical care is treatments that have no intention of treating the illness or even slowing the illness. The goal is to make you more comfortable. Its goal is to minimize symptoms, particularly pain and suffering. And so one of the things we've realized, and this isn't just in Catholic circles, but definitely we've noticed it, is sometimes you reach a point where what people really want is alleviation from the undue suffering, and they're much more willing to face the possibility of death and not doing some extraordinary treatments if they can be more comfortable in the meantime. And so the idea of palliative care is when we've reached a point where we've reached extraordinary medical care that we would rather not do, we can instead focus on the comfort of the person and making sure that to the best of reasonable ability, we're helping them with these end-of-life times, doing it with dignity and hopefully without excessive suffering. So there were a number of examples. The two I decided to list is pain medication. One that I thought was notable mention was like anxiety medication. This is when the issue isn't, a mental health issue, but, you're facing death, and maybe that's something that makes you very anxious. Giving an anxiety medicine to help you with that would be palliative. All right. And the final category, which I'm hoping is pretty obvious to Catholics, is not moral, but it is a category, which is medical treatments purposely intended to hasten death, right? That's the goal of the medication, or whatever it is. I guess it doesn't have to be medication. It could be surgical. It could be a number of other things. The obvious example of this is euthanasia drugs, but a really important thing to understand when we talk about hastening death is that the intent, or is it a side effect? When it's the intent, it is always fully immoral. There are a number of scenarios where it's not the intent, but it is a side effect, particularly of the palliative care, that makes it so it is likely morally a reasonable thing to do. We'll talk about that more later. Okay, so let's get into Catholic teaching. They had one paragraph. Every once in a while, the USCCB just nails it, and this time they did it beautifully. The whole picture. Just one. If you want one paragraph, and to frustrate me to no end, they have this whole document with numbered paragraphs, and then they have this one and then at the beginning of each section they have an introduction paragraph that's not numbered for some reason. So 54 is the last paragraph of the previous section, then this is in the introduction, and then paragraph 55 is the first paragraph below that in this document. So I'm calling it paragraph 54 and a half. The truth that life is a precious gift from God has profound implications for the question of stewardship over human life. We are not the owners of our own lives, and hence do not have absolute power over life. We have a duty to preserve our life and use it for the glory of God. But the duty to preserve life is not absolute. For we may reject life-prolonging procedures that are insufficiently beneficial or excessively burdensome. Suicide and euthanasia are never morally acceptable options. So if you're looking for one paragraph that sums it all up, that's about as good as you can get. Life is precious. We need to remember that it's precious. And we should be doing things medically to prolong life so that we can serve God, so that we can make use of this wonderful gift of life that we have. But there comes a point where medical interventions are insufficiently beneficial for all of the side effects and everything that goes along with them, or excessively burdensome in some fashion. And again, that could be for your body, that could be financially, a number of scenarios. And you just say, I can't do this much. Life will end. It is okay to accept that reality. Okay. But I like bullets. People who know me know I like bullets. So let's put it in bullet form. We are morally obligated to receive ordinary care. We cannot morally reject that. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat here in that bodily autonomy is something the church believes in a great deal. But just because we have bodily autonomy and have the right to choose things for ourselves doesn't mean that all of those choices are moral. So if we're wanting to make a moral choice, we are never rejecting ordinary medical care. Now remember, ordinary medical care is not excessively burdensome. And we are allowed to, but not required to receive extraordinary care. So we can do it if we feel like it's worth the effort. You know, generally for myself, I tend to think the younger I am or a person is, the more likely I'm willing to go through something that might be more torturous in the short term, but I have assumably a much longer period to enjoy the benefits of trying to do that later. Whereas I'm in my 70s, 80s, 90s, more likely to say, well, you know, I'll just focus on the few good years I have left and not go through something that probably won't extend it much anyway and just be very burdensome in the meantime. So we're allowed to, but not required. We can choose to say, no, that's too much. And palliative care is good, even if it has side effects, even if those side effects may hasten death. So the classic example of this is the use of, it's not heroin, what's the, morphine, thank you. Why do I got heroin on my brain? Morphine, right, is a very helpful drug in when there's a lot of pain. But heavy use of it can hasten death. It can speed those things along. And the balancing act that a good palliative doctor is doing is finding that right balance of not hastening too much, but also making sure that person's pain is managed appropriately. But it is okay that if it ends up hastening it to some degree, we don't have to refuse it just because it might do that. On the other hand, we can never take a medication or do something whose only purpose, the reason we are doing it, is to hasten death. That is euthanasia, that is suicide, those are things that are immoral. Okay, wow. I am remarkably ahead of schedule today because here we are, intermission reminders. For asking questions on the live stream, now is a really good time to write them down and get them in because we're going to have an intermission. That's an opportunity for us to catch up, for us to review your questions, and we'll answer them just after the break. So if you're on the live stream and you have a question, get them in before you go. Grab yourself a soda from the fridge. On YouTube, get logged in if you can using your Gmail account, your Google account, your YouTube account, and you just write all capitals Deacon Question for your comment. If you just can't do that, go to deaconken.org/blog/chat. Do the same thing, and we will be back in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back. On to question and answer. We will start with the questions online. What do we have, Peter?
Does the church have any guidance on instances where it's morally appropriate to take someone off life support?
Yes. All right, just as a note for the future, we're not crossing this line here in the middle. Go around the back. You're okay. That's why that rope is there. Could you repeat the question?
Does the church have any guidance on instances where it is morally appropriate to take someone off of life support?
Okay, yes. And the simplest answer is the guidance is you're allowed to do it. But allowed and should is where life gets interesting. So whenever somebody is on life support, and we're talking about a ventilator or something like that, it is acceptable to remove that and let nature take its course. However, just because that is allowable doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. You can, and I'm not using moral here, I'm using right, to create a subtle separation here, because the church does have to create, walls of where you've for sure gone too far, but recognize that there's a vagueness in the middle. And so I would think the church would also say that it takes some discernment and understanding to say, how long should this person be on life support before we consider removing it? And that might depend on, is there an ongoing illness? Is this something that just happened? Was this a 30-year-old who collapsed in their bedroom and otherwise is perfectly healthy, and we're going to see if we can, hopefully the life support will bring them back? Or is this a 97-year-old who has both congestive heart failure and kidney cancer, and things are going to end pretty soon no matter what? These things matter. But the short answer is, at a simple level, the church allows us to use our discernment and judgment to make good decisions about what is excessively burdensome in these moments. And if it is excessively burdensome for them to be on life support, whether, again, that be cost or to the person, then it is acceptable to say, okay, no more ventilator. We will talk about some of these things in more detail as we get into some of the scenarios. All right, we had a question here, but we need a microphone. Did we have any more online, Peter, or just that one? Oh, we got one more coming? Just that one. All right.
Okay, you said off life support, you're talking ventilator, but what about just food and water?
Okay. Unless, be very careful about what we mean. And food and water is something that the church probably has gotten more specific than anything else. And because of a person, the older people here remember, named Terry Schiavo, right? That really got the church thinking about that scenario, because all that person needed was a feeding tube. All Terry needed was a feeding tube to stay alive. And her husband was able to starve her to death by removing that feeding tube. It took 2 weeks for her to die off of that feeding tube. And the church says, no, that is immoral, that is unacceptable. There is a minor caveat here, is that there are certain illnesses, certain times during certain illnesses, where your body stops being able to digest and process food. It's just causing bloating, or your body can't do anything with it. In those scenarios, it's reasonable to say this food is not helping them, and it's only harming them, and therefore it is okay to remove food in that scenario. But in a scenario where the food is keeping them alive, and that's all that's needed to keep them alive, that is ordinary care, even if it is delivered in a medical fashion like a feeding tube. Any other on here? Microphone, make sure we get there.
There are 1,000.
Yeah, you're good. Just
Go.
close to the mouth.
There are 1,000 scenarios for what we just discussed. What about the brain dead patient that can survive on food? That doesn't seem like it would be ordinary.
So we have to be very careful about our terms here. Someone who all they need is food and water and otherwise can survive is not brain dead. They are in a persistent vegetative state. Brain death is a very specific set of criteria that the body will not operate anymore and will deteriorate without ventilators and all kinds of other machines to keep them alive. So there are basically two ways to determine death. Way number one is the very standard, it's pulmonary, vascular pulmonary or something like that. But basically, is the person breathing? Is their heart beating on its own? That's the traditional method, right? That's been used for eons. But because we now have machines that can simulate those things, they have come up with a criteria for brain death. And in brain death, there is a cessation of electrical activity in the brain to the degree that it is not doing anything of note. And that is not the same thing as a person is in a persistent vegetative state who their brain's doing enough to keep the heart pumping, the lungs breathing, the stomach digesting, all of those things. They may not have higher brain function, but they have brain stem function is really what it boils down to. And the church says they're a human being with full human dignity, and removing their food is removing their food, no different than from a poor person or whatever. That is actually one of the scenarios here on my list of official scenarios, so we're going to cover it again, but always good to answer the question when it comes up.
Would there be any scenarios where it is encouraged by the church to take them off of life support?
Well, encouraged is a strong word, but if we take encouraged in the softer sense, that the church would say, it's okay, it's fine to do that. Or even to say, I hope you really recognize how burdensome this thing you're doing is for that patient. And try to give them some counsel and guidance. But I can't imagine a scenario where the church would be more specific than that, right? Where the general idea would be, here's the big thing I think to take away from this. The church wants us to understand these principles and apply them for ourselves and for those people we're caring for who can't make those decisions for themselves. The church does not want to slice this into fine little categories and say, okay, there's 7,048 categories. In category 1, let them go. Category 2, keep them alive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They recognize, and remember what I said about how this changes over time, and it changes where you live, right? Maybe what a millionaire might do as opposed to a lower middle class person might do would be very different. It's hard to say things that way, but it's true. So the church gives us a great deal of leeway here, but it wants to set up the principles by which we are doing the appropriate things so that we can use good personal discernment to make good medical choices. So I think it would be pretty strong to say there'd ever be a moment where the church is like, let them die. You command some big booming church voice. All right, done with the online questions? Okay. Let's go into the scenarios. So, these are going to sound pretty familiar-ish, but we'll go through them. The patient's on life support scenario. So the patient is on a ventilator and minimally conscious. Prognosis suggests their condition won't improve. What are your obligations as care providers or the person making the decision? And that maybe, I said minimally conscious, but what if we imagine a scenario where they have a bit more consciousness? Whoever the person is who's responsible for making the decisions, what are their obligations? One, we must continue to give them ordinary care as long as they remain on the ventilator. So they need that food and water. They need those basic antibiotics. They need, a good, bed maintenance and stuff like that. All of those things must continue. And note, the ventilator is indeed extraordinary care. So that's what we have to do. We have to maintain ordinary care. What are our options? Our options are to keep them on life support to see if the prognosis is wrong or premature, or if perhaps this person will, improve over time. And that's a very reasonable thing to consider doing. There are plenty of cases where people have relatively unexpectedly, significantly improved when we didn't expect it. The other option is to remove life support, that we've reached the point that we agree with the prognosis. We recognize that at this point is overly burdensome to them, maybe to the people, maybe to the family, all of those things. It is extraordinary care, so we can do that. And it is important to remember, because people will often say something like this, well, that's killing them. No, it's not killing them. The ventilator is keeping them alive, and it is the illness that requires the ventilator that is, in the end, going to cause their death. Removing a ventilator, not doing a medical intervention, is not killing someone. The thing that kills them is the disease, and we need to be careful with our language and say that. It is never killing somebody to remove them from a ventilator. Oh, microphone. Come on, Peter. Let's focus on microphones and not, up here, and not snacks, eh? Snack time's over.
When you remove somebody from a ventilator, you still have to keep the ordinary care going.
That is an excellent point. Yes, that. It's hiding in the language here, but you're right. It's not as clear as it could be. The ordinary care must continue as long as that person is alive. The removing of the life support does not release you of that obligation. And actually, there's plenty of cases. In fact, one of the best way to get a person to breathe on their own is to take them off the ventilator and see what happens. And there's been lots of cases of people they didn't think would start breathing on their own that did. And so if you were to remove things like food and water and whatever while that was happening, then yeah, you're robbing from them that potential opportunity. So you're absolutely right. Ordinary medical care must continue even if the ventilator is removed. Okay, next scenario. The persistent vegetative state. This is the one we just talked about. The patient is on a feeding tube, but nothing else. They're only minimally conscious, if at all, and the prognosis suggests their condition won't improve. Obligations, we have to continue to give them ordinary care. We have to continue to feed them. We have to continue to give them hydration. And it's very important to note, this is a mentally handicapped person. Severely so, but that's what they are. They're a mentally handicapped person. And we as Catholics do not see them as non-persons. There are certain philosophical models that remove personhood of people who are severely brain damaged. We don't. If that person can breathe and digest and everything on their own, they deserve the right to life. And it is not appropriate to remove ordinary medical care because we view their quality of life as insufficient. One thing that could be done is to consider putting a do not resuscitate in place. If they were to have heart failure all of a sudden, for a normal person, you would, get out the paddles, do what you would to bring them back. For someone in this state, I think it would be more reasonable to say, look, if they've reached the point that now something else is happening, something else is robbing them of their ability to live, I think it's time to let nature take its course, not to do excessive medical interventions to keep them alive. And so for those who don't know, a DNR is do not resuscitate order. So that would be a reasonable thing to do, and it would be reasonable for the medical professionals to let nature take its course and not do any extraordinary actions to keep them alive. But you have to do the basics. You have to give them the food and the water, the basic antibiotics, all that kind of stuff. A lot of people struggle with this one. And what I would say is be careful of the slippery slope here. When we start saying certain people who basically are, who are alive, not basically, are alive, lose their personhood, where does that start creeping to? Is it all of a sudden Down syndrome people aren't really people because they don't have the quality of life of the rest of us? There's a real risk here if we don't set a nice, firm line that says people who can live with only ordinary care are people. And actually, they're all people, but they're people who deserve the right to keep living. If we don't set that sort of a line, it creates a creeping mantra of, well, I wouldn't want to live like that. Well, I wouldn't want to live like this. Well, I wouldn't want to live like this. And ironically, we end up doing it in a way where everybody below us doesn't have that dignity. And the line creeps up because we look at a Down syndrome person, we'd say, gosh, that would be rough. I wouldn't want to live like that. And so all of a sudden these lines keep creeping up. And actually, I don't bring up Down syndrome for nothing. Something like 80% of Down syndrome fetuses are aborted. It's an example of where people have said, that's not a life worth having, so I'm going to get rid of it before it's born. These types of thinking creep into the mind of society, and they're not good. And so we have to draw this line very clearly and say every person, no matter how mentally handicapped, who can live on their own with ordinary care, deserves the right to keep living. And we should not take that away from them by starving them to death or otherwise robbing them of the ordinary care that we would give to every single other human being. Okay. And I know that's hard. I don't say that with the arrogance of thinking that it's not scary, the idea that if I was in a vegetative state, what would I think of myself kind of thing. I get it. I really do get it. But I think in part because it's so scary, we have to be very careful and not let our fears drive it, but let a good ethical framework of morality drive it. All right, the heart condition scenario. We got somebody who's likely to die soon due to heart failure, right? They, valves failing, whatever, all kinds of problems that happen. What are our obligations? Again, we must continue to give them ordinary care. This probably includes like an oxygen tank, right? Because a lot of times for heart issues, keeping the oxygen flowing really helps. So, giving them an oxygen tank these days, it's very ordinary care here in the West. Perhaps in some places in the world it wouldn't be, but definitely here. And again, that's only if it is effective to helping them in their heart condition. What are our options? Well, we could go the extraordinary route. We could consider surgery. We could consider a transplant. But we could also choose not to. And again, this would depend. Are you somebody who sees that there's a long life out there after a transplant, that you think that because remember also, you can take the burdensome part as you're burdening a society. Every heart that somebody takes that then they die a year or two later is taking a heart from somebody who's going to live for 20 years. And so as an individual who would be receiving that heart, you might want to ask yourself, is that the right decision both for me and for the community and the common good? That's not a decision an external person should force upon us, but it is something to consider. It's unduly burdensome to society to be taking a transplant that is not going to do that much good for us. But we could consider it, so we have to think it through. Is that the right thing to do, to go to that level of extraordinary care? But we could also choose not to. We could also say, no, I'm in my 80s or 90s or whatever. I think it's probably best to just accept that heart failure is what's going to get me someday, and I'm going to do the best with the years I have left. Another thing you consider is, again, putting a DNR, particularly for heart attack, right? That somebody who thinks they're going to die of a heart failure, don't try to start my heart when you know it's about to fail anyway. So that would be a reasonable scenario to say, to do that. All right, another one. Late-stage cancer, obviously another very common type scenario. Patient is likely to die soon from cancer. Again, what are our obligations? Ordinary medical care, food, water, antibiotics, etc. What are our options? What could we do? We could continue cancer treatments like chemo, radiation, or whatever to extend life, or if we still have hope for it, a cure that might make the cancer go away. The scenario is that's very unlikely, but we could choose to do that. Or we could choose to stop treatment. We could say, I've heard this from cancer patients who are, dealing with it. It's really hard. And if I'm thinking I got 6 to 9 months to live just naturally, and maybe 9 to 12 months to live if I keep doing the treatments, but my life is going, I'll be able to say goodbye and be, awake and aware in those things because I don't have the burden of those treatments. Maybe I'm going to choose the 6 to 9 months, and that is a reasonable choice if you view those treatments to be overly burdensome to yourself. Or you could say, nope, my grandson's getting married in 9 months. I want to make it to the wedding, and I'm going to put myself through that. Most definitely, and by the way, a lot of these things could be applied in other scenarios, but I kind of chose the places where they're most common. So palliative care is very common in cancer situations. People who die of heart failure are more likely to go like this than not always, but than someone with cancer who tends to be a very prolonged, difficult process. So giving them palliative care to reduce pain, again, even though it might hasten death, if the goal is to manage pain, that's okay. And then again, we could consider putting a DNR in place if that's appropriate. Any other scenario? Those are the end of the scenarios I had. Any other scenarios we should try walking through before I go on to the third-party medical decision stuff? Oh, Rita's got one.
I actually have a friend who has MS, and she is bedridden. She has a feeding tube, and the doctors are not giving her the palliative care that she has requested. I mean, by the end of the month, they've got her on a certain amount of pain meds. She is in so much pain. Where is the obligation for the medical field?
Yeah, no, they and I don't want to be overly presumptive here. I don't obviously know the particulars of the situation, and we do doctors do deserve a fair amount of discretion in these spaces. But there is definitely some disagreement in the medical field about what's appropriate. What I would suggest in this case is very likely for that person to get in touch with a hospice type care system, because there are people who tend to more recognize the value of palliative care and those sorts of things.
She was in hospice, and her primary care decided to
she's going to live too long.
Out.
Yeah. And that's tough. But maybe connections, and again, I don't know all the details, but maybe connections with those people. You can get a doctor who's in hospice to say, okay, she doesn't belong in hospice yet, but remember what our goals are here, and all of those things. So there are definitely different doctors with different perspectives, and finding one who better understands the value of palliative care is a good thing. It's hard, right? And in fairness to the doctor who's on the other side of that, they are thinking from a life-saving perspective. They're thinking, if I give this woman that much, whatever, she's going to be dead in 2 weeks. I can't do that to her. And the church would actually say, if that's what this lady needs to be comfortable, and she is okay with the idea that it may mean she's going to be dead in 2 weeks, that's okay.
It's more because he knows that she is going to be addicted to this drug, which she is, and she knows it.
Yeah.
But her life is not very quality.
Yeah. And these decisions are hard. But yeah, that's a factor as well, addiction. To be honest, the church in this space doesn't talk much about the addictive factor and how to balance that. So gives a pretty wide berth to the medical professionals. Okay, on to third-party medical decisions. So who makes a decision for a patient? Just, forget any particular scenario. It should be the patient. It should be the person, assuming they are conscious and capable. Their cognitive skills are where they need to be. That should always be true. If that person can make these decisions on their own, it is their responsibility to decide for themselves, and they should be doing that. If they're not, then who makes the decisions? The best answer is that this person has done the right things and put medical directives in place and said, I want my daughter Sue, or I want my husband, or first my husband, but since I made it 8 years ago, now that my husband's gone, it's back to my daughter Sue. Making these decisions of the person that they trust to make these decisions, the person that hopefully they've most communicated their desires to, and it's written down in a directive, is the best way to go. It removes so many problems. And I would say to everyone who particularly is over 65, but maybe even 50, having a medical directive of what you want is a very good thing. And you don't have to get too detailed, particularly if you have a person you trust. So that's who should do it, because the patient decided that's who should do it. If the patient hasn't given that kind of guidance, then it's up to the competent authority, and this varies on the situation, to make a decision of who that is. I've heard of lots of different scenarios. My mind always shudders when I hear about it. A lot of times it ends up being kind of a group decision of all of the children, and those things can get really ugly. And this is why I really do want to encourage people. Consider making directives so that it's clear who's in charge. The title of this topic is, Can I Take My Mom Off of Life Support? My mom has specifically gone through all of this and very specifically didn't choose me. She's a quick plug puller. She doesn't want to go through anything. And I'm like, Mom, I think your life is worth more. And she's like, no, you're going to hang on too long. I'm picking somebody else. And that's her right and her choice. She's decided to do that. And it's, I think, good that she's picking someone that she feels is going to make a good decision. I have my qualms about what they might do in certain scenarios, but at the end of the day, she has to make that decision. I'm glad that she has spent the time to think that through and put a directive in place. So if we can walk away from one thing beyond how to make these decisions from tonight, is the importance of having these documents in place. And then how do we decide we're that third-party person? We decide by following their directives to the best of their care. And that could both be the formal directives that are in the document. It could also be the instructions that you were given when they were still healthy. But actually, I would say there's one caveat to this. There are limits to what we can follow and for our own conscience. So let's say, for purpose of discussion, my mom did put me in charge of this, and I open up her document, and she says, if I've been in situation X, I want euthanasia. Nope, not going to happen, Mom. She can get somebody else to do it, but I have a moral obligation as the person, if I was the person in charge, to ensure she has ordinary medical care and has never specifically hastened death with the purpose of hastening death. And even if her directive disagreed with that, my moral obligation is to do what's right, even if she doesn't see it as right. And again, that's probably why she chose somebody. I don't think she actually is interested in that. I don't want to be too specific here about my own mother, but speaking theoretically, and then, yeah, that person, I think it probably is the right decision to pick somebody else. It's our job to hopefully talk them out of that inappropriate decision. But our goal is to follow the directives that they've given us as long as they're moral directives. If they are immoral directives, not doing ordinary care, not respecting the dignity of the patient and doing things like euthanasia, then we have a moral obligation to ignore the orders. That may not be what the state decides. The state may decide what's in the document overrides what we said, even though we have that position, and they'll say, you don't have that choice, but we should go down with a good conscience, knowing that we did what we could to prevent what was immoral. Any questions about that, about medical directives? Okay, let's get into the conclusion stuff then. I'm actually going to end here like on schedule. This is unprecedented. All right, conclusion reminders. So we're going to go through some conclusion slides. People who are on the live stream, if you have some final questions, get them in now. As I said, you're 1 to 2 minutes behind us, particularly when you type something in. I don't want to get to the end from my perspective, and your question is still, a minute away in the ether. So get the questions in now. That will ensure that they're there when we get to the final Q&A at the end of the conclusion slides. Same rules as before. Get logged in on YouTube. Use your Gmail account, your Google account, your YouTube account. Go into the chat session in YouTube. All capitals, Deacon Question. And then if you can't do that, go to deaconken.org/blog/chat and do the same thing. Okay, conclusion. I like simple bullets. Ordinary care is required. Extraordinary care is not. Palliative care is good. Euthanasia is not. There you go. 4 simple bullets, right? Just down to the thing. Now, obviously, the details inside that get really complicated. But we want to put it in 4 quick little things. There it is. Ordinary care is required. Extraordinary care is not. Palliative care is good. Euthanasia is not. All right. Satisfaction survey. For those who are here in person, there's actually 2 of them. We'll talk about both. One is just for tonight. What'd you think of the talk? Did you make any faux pas that ticked you off? How was the audio and the video? All those kinds of things. Also for you who are watching on YouTube, there's the video and then there's the description and there's a show more. If you click the show more, you will find a link to the satisfaction survey. Please fill those out, particularly for those of you online. I mean, everyone in person, please as well. But you can just come up to me and say what you think. For those of you online, that's your vehicle to let me know. And I have changed these talks so much because of the good feedback I have gotten. One of the things I used to get pounded on was reading too much, long paragraphs. And people are like, I just can't take it, Ken. So I've really cut that down, right? I read 1 paragraph today, and that was like, even in my mind, am I doing too much? So I do take this feedback very seriously. It helps me talk better. It helps me present better things. Also, there's an option within there to say what you'd like to see in the future, to write down topics that you'd like to see in future sessions. There is a second survey, and this one I don't think is linked in the video, but the link is here, or you can go to ken.org/blog and find it there, which is a survey about what we want, not how was this talk, but what we're looking from these talks in the future. There's a whole bunch of topics, say which ones you would like to see, whether you'd like to see some of the things I've done in years past repeated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So fill that out. And so here in person, if you look, there were 2 piles of surveys on the table, 1 for each, and feel free to fill them both out. Volunteers, particularly if this ever grows in size again, I can definitely use some more volunteers. people to help with setting out food or purchasing food. If we ever get back to having childcare, people who might help with that. Also with live streaming, we normally have 3 cameras. There's 1 camera here to point at the question asker. We didn't have that tonight because my normal volunteer is picking up their daughter at the airport, some stupid thing like that, family. So if I had more volunteers, I'd be able to do these things more regularly. So if you feel like you're up to it, I would love to have you in any of these kinds of roles. For those of you on live stream, definitely, but you're thinking I'd like to come in the future in person, email me at ken@deaconken.org. Next time, Tuesday, December 14th, 7 p.m. The topic is a repeat, but not one that I've live streamed before. Was Jesus born in December? So we're going to be in December, Advent. We're going to talk about all the Christmas stuff, what we know about the historical Jesus' birth. And so we'll go over a lot of things in that space, not just that one question, kind of like I do here. I think I last did this one in it was December of 2018 or 2019, so it's been quite a while. And as I said, it wasn't live streamed, so the only people in person saw it, so I'm going to live stream it. Future topics, January, should I be accepting when others sin? This is the big issue of what does it mean to be accepting of somebody else? When is it appropriate to challenge someone when they're sinning? Just this whole area of what does it mean to be loving? What does it mean to be accepting? What does it mean to recognize and point out sin? And when is it appropriate to do these things? There's a lot of stuff going on in our society where you have to accept me, you have to accept me. And there's some good in those thinkings, but there's some definite excesses as well. So we're going to talk about those from a Catholic perspective and how we should go about dealing with this constant request for acceptance in a way that is healthy and productive. February, what does the church teach about transgender issues? This is a big and important one. For any of you who have children, it's bigger than you could possibly understand. Seriously, and I'm not joking around. The statistics here are scary. And if we don't fully understand what's going on here, there could be some significant health consequences to our children in the decades to come. So, very important one, and one I think is very important to talk about. March during Lent, so we'll talk about how do I overcome my own habitual sin. This is more of a working session. This is not there's there's some definitive path, but just talking through some of the strategies we might consider, what some of the pitfalls might be of those strategies, how we can deal with overcoming sin. I'm not claiming perfection in this. I am walking around with a habitual sin that clearly is kicking my ass. So this is not a claim like I know exactly how to do this, but that doesn't mean there aren't a bunch of strategies I've heard of, I've tried with some success and failures and other times, and we can talk through a number of possibilities. April, how is the Bible organized? Kind of just your overview of the Bible topic. May, I may substitute in something here, but if the crowd sizes have grown, we'll do a Q&A session based on pre-submitted topics, kind of those things that are not a full session, but, there's a 5 to 10 minute answer appropriate. And I'm always looking for future topics. I have a big list. I'm struggling always to squeeze them in, but I always am trying to find those ones that are most current to people. So please let me know what you'd like to see. I won't spend long here. Pause the video if you want to see it. DeaconQuestion.org. It's that simple. It all goes through there. And email is ken@deaconquen.org. It's very complicated. All right. Actually, one big announcement this month. Something I have been moving towards for many years now. But after I was ordained, I entered a program to train me as an Ignatian spiritual director, and I completed that training last spring, and I would like to put those skills to good use for a small group of people who are most in need of it. I do have limited availability. I work full-time. I have a family. I have all my other deacon responsibilities. And so I've come to the conclusion that I can do no more than 8 sessions a month. If you express interest, there will be a kind of matching process. It might be that I'm not the right person from you, and I can tell you some other options you could consider, because there are some. But I am going to expect from everyone who would sign up that they can commit to a half hour of daily prayer, and at least some of that being directed by me, of suggesting what you would be doing with that prayer time. It also will not be free. This is in part to help figure out who the right people are. A lot of people don't know deacons aren't paid. We are an entirely volunteer position. And when I'm doing something like for the parish that's not particular to an individual, it's very easy to just say, well, I'm here to serve God. But when we start talking about helping individuals, at some level, every person I'm helping is taking me away from helping somebody else. And so you have to find those ways to filter things, and I've struggled a lot with this. But frankly, I wouldn't mind doing this as a full-time thing, and the only way that happens is if people start paying me. So maybe if enough people are interested, someday I'll go half-time at my professional job and could use this money to direct a whole lot more people than I could do right now. So I think $500 a year is a very reasonable fee. We're talking, if for 12 session, that's $40, $45 a session. I mean, you think of anything else in life where you can get an hour of somebody's time for that figure. It's pretty small. So hopefully that is not seen as greedy by some. And if you do, I apologize, I guess. If you're interested, go to deaconken.org/spiritual-direction. And you can learn more about it. At the end, what you'll be asked to do is to email me with a list of answers to questions. It's kind of, you consider it your application. It's more of a matching process than a true application. But I want some questions, and then we'll meet and talk it through. I promise everyone will be given a fair hearing, so don't feel like if you don't do a good job on your questions, I'm just going to be like, that's not how it's going to be. So hopefully this is something beneficial to some of you, and I'll be able to help a handful plus of people in the years to come. Final thing you can do for me is to subscribe on YouTube. There's just things you get as when your channel has a lot of subscribers. I need to get to 1,000. I think actually this number 820 is not good. I'm down to 813, so that number every month gets chopped by about 5 to 10. But you kind of hit this point where you get more and more, and the number starts growing more aggressively. So I'm hoping in the next couple years I could somehow knock out those 800. And if not, I don't. But you can help me by subscribing. It makes it so that when you go to the main YouTube page, I'm much more likely to be suggested as a video. If you are subscribing to other places, well, for sure, if you're subscribing to me, you would see those videos. But then other people who subscribe to similar things might be presented mine, even if they're not a subscriber. So there's reasons that it's helpful. Please do it if you haven't. All right, final questions. What do we have starting online? Their faces when there's nothing. All right. Anything, from in the room?
It was a couple of years ago that a relative was having issues at Sutter Hospital, and they sat with us and explained palliative care. And we were deeply insulted for them to perceive that our loved one should not return to the hospital next time an issue happens. It was our first introduction to palliative care, but when I saw the bullet and it said palliative care is good, I didn't have a positive response to that for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And the individual, the loved one, passed probably 2 years later. I might be off on the date, but it was not at that point that we as a family wanted to say, I'm not accepting your washing away our concern and our intervention processes. So I just take exception to the palliative care is good, depending on the point at which it is implemented.
So yeah, here's what I would say in response to that. I think they were misapplying the term palliative care. Palliative care does not... Hospice, indeed, is when you've made a decision where you're not going to do any more medical intervention. And deciding to go to hospice is deciding to say, I'm done with medical intervention. Palliative and hospice are not the same thing. They have a relationship. As I mentioned to Rita, if you want good palliative care, getting involved with people who are involved in hospice is going to get you more likely to get a doctor who's more understanding of good palliative care. But I think what you've pointed out is sometimes the inverse creeps in, maybe unintentionally, maybe intentionally, where people are assuming palliative care only has to do something with a hospice environment. And that is not true at all. There's nothing in the definition of palliative care that presumes you won't consider additional medical interventions. So I was careful in my wording. I don't mean that. And I think they are misusing the term palliative care if they're saying that's what it means. Palliative care means focusing on the symptoms, but it doesn't. You're not restricted to only using palliative care. The one area where I do think it does get a little complicated is we talked about how with some of the things you would do in palliative care might hasten death, even if unintentionally, might damage some organs, things like that. And so you could see where there's a temptation, even if overused, to say, look, this person is in the process of damaging things because they're wanting to be comfortable. We shouldn't be bending over backwards to fix those things that they're damaging, right? And so I do, and that's, I think, where hospice kind of brings a cohesive whole together, a recognition of all of those things, and we're recognizing that we've reached that end point, and so we're just going to go down that one palliative-only path. But I would say that it is not, palliative care is not exclusive to hospice, and it can be used in other scenarios where you're still planning on fighting various things. So someone who's still taking cancer treatments can do palliative care. The doctor's probably going to say, hey, you don't want to go too far. It's going to undermine this work we're doing with our cancer treatments. But the definition of palliative care is it's care that is focused on alleviating suffering, alleviating the symptoms. But it is not an exclusive. You are allowed to do palliative and other care.
If I can add to that, the perception that we as a family received was that it would be to accept the palliative care philosophy at this point in time for this individual. It would relieve the financial effect and the effect on the hospital care, and it's really not going to serve any purpose. That was a perception. And Lois, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, so there's definitely some factors there. We keep toying within this country with the idea of universal medical care, right? And in some cases, with good reason, we want everyone to be able to have medical care. But one of the reasonable counter concerns to that is we start putting bureaucrats who are focused more on penny pinching in charge of certain things, because they're looking at, I'm collecting X much in revenue, and I want to ensure that our costs are lower than that. And if that means encouraging more people to consider non-intervention palliative care, it's very tempting to do those things. There's actually, I think, that is not the only scenario where those kinds of things happen, but I do think that with HMOs and various Medicare and other things, we are dealing with those very difficult issues of incentives to save costs, that are not from the perspective of what the patient reasonably wants and deserves. And that's very concerning, and the church is very concerned about that. So it sounds like you kind of ran into that in this case of, and I don't want to get too deep into the specifics, but of that kind of thinking being too dominant. And I think it's absolutely right for the family to say, no. We expect care like X, Y, and Z, and, we do pay our insurance premiums, and that's why you should be providing the care that your insurance says it should provide. Good. I'm glad the end result was positive. But, yeah, it is a risk, and it may be a good part of what you've added to this conversation is if you're in a scenario where you're talking about that, you might want to get a bead on that doctor and whether they're misinterpreting the request for palliative care as being a request for hospice, and recognizing that there's a bit of a pitfall there of people over presuming an overly tight connection between them. So that's a very good addition to the conversation. Other questions before we wrap up? All right, I'll take that as a no. My bomb here has 17 minutes to go, but we'll we'll let it go. Oh, sure, yep.
This might be for the good of the group online also, but DNRs. Is there a formal process for that? Is the church recommending, or does our diocese have a format, a template type of thing that we could use?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately out of my depth here. So all I can do is say, yes, there are things like what you mentioned. I'm not in a good position to recommend them. I believe on our diocesan website there are some resources. I'm pretty sure there's also some resources on the USCCB website. I would also say that there are different documents that often get colloquially referred to as if they're the same thing. Most people, when they say the term DNR, in fact, I think I did this, are really referring to an advanced medical directive. A DNR, and that is a more comprehensive thing of looking at what kind of medical care you want and who's going to be in charge of those decisions. It often gets called a DNR because part of the decisions you can make in that advanced medical directive is a do not resuscitate order. But technically speaking, a DNR is a much more limited document that says if scenarios X, Y, or Z happen, don't resuscitate me in those scenarios. So, I think people should be very careful if they're going to have a specific DNR, that they understand that it is a very specific set of things about when you shouldn't resuscitate. But there are and so if someone went looking for a DNR and said that and say, wait a minute, this is how to kill me, right? To understand there's another document, and maybe more than one other documents, I'm not well versed, that is a broader set, that these advanced medical directives, that there's power of medical attorney or something like that, don't quote me on the terms, that are broader documents speaking to what you want medically done. And frankly, that's more what I think I'm encouraging. Even though a DNR does make sense in particular moments, what I would really suggest people do is those broader documents that say, this is the kind of care I want, this is the kind of care I don't want, here's who is in charge of these decisions when I can no longer make them myself. And really, you want a list, right? Because who you think that is today, and you file that document, and there are ways indeed to file it. You can file it with your doctor, with your HMO. There are ways to do that, and again, I'm not well versed here. But then you forget, and 10 years goes by, and that good friend that lived next door turned out to be a real jerk, and you're not friends with him anymore, and he moved out of state or whatever. If you don't have anybody below that, it's harder, right? So having a list of this person first, then this person, then this person. So if they themselves die or are no longer interested, you have other people to do it. So yeah, a DNR is probably way too limited to think. Yeah. I apologize for not having more. I have the gift of being young enough, although I'm getting close, where I should be starting to think about these things, but it's a little bit out there. They ask all the deacons to say, who do you want to serve at your funeral and stuff? And, a lot of deacons are pretty old, so reasonable questions. I'm thinking, I'm hoping I'm living for at least another 30, 40, maybe 50 years. I don't know what deacons are going to be alive then. How do I know who's going to serve at my funeral, So, yeah, God willing, let's get some real wood around here. That's what happens. But, sooner rather than later, I should be thinking about advanced medical directives and stuff. Yeah. All right, let's wrap up with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, thank you again for bringing us together this evening and for the many ways that you bless us. As we go forth, help us to well understand the goal of good medical care and also the wise discernment of how to navigate those very difficult waters. Be with us in spirit as we navigate them so that everything we do can be for your glory. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. God bless you all. I hope you have a wonderful evening. We will, at least in this sense, see you in December 14th.